In the middle of the night, the Boeing 747-230B plane carrying 246 passengers and 23 crew members was calmly moving towards Seoul through the route over the Pacific Ocean. But then, Soviet commanders launch a missile attack on it. And before the pilots can understand what's happening to them, the plane crashes and falls into the sea, and all the passengers and crew members on board lose their lives. This is the tragic story of Korean airline Flight 007. So why did this incident happen? Whose mistake was it? And what enmity led Soviet commanders to take the lives of 269 innocent people? Let me tell you about it in detail. Before starting the video, we request you to please subscribe to our channel. Creating content like this requires a lot of time and effort, and your subscription encourages us to keep producing such content. So, let's now start the video. On the night of August 31, 1983, 246 passengers and 23 crew members board a Korean airline Flight 007. This flight was scheduled to fly from Kennedy Airport in New York to Gimpo Airport in Seoul, South Korea. Most of the passengers on board were Koreans, and there were also passengers from various countries such as the United States, Japan, the Philippines, and Taiwan. Flight 007 was supposed to fly directly from New York to Seoul, but it had to stop in Anchorage, Alaska, for refueling. The aircraft used in this flight, the Boeing 747-230B, was considered one of the most advanced and safe planes of its time. It made its first flight on January 28, 1972, and had a good track record since then. The flight was commanded by 45-year-old Captain Chun Byung-in, who had 10,627 hours of flying experience. He had been flying this particular route for the past 5 years, so nothing here was new or unfamiliar to him. In the cabin with him was 47-year-old First Officer Sun Dong-hui, who had a total flying experience of 8,917 hours. Additionally, the 31-year-old flight engineer, Kim Yu-dong, on the plane had a total experience of 4,012 flight hours. That night, the plane's route was over the world's largest ocean, the Pacific Ocean, specifically the northernmost of the 5 predefined routes in the North Pacific. This route is called Romeo 20, and airlines prefer it because it is the shortest route for crossing the ocean. This route has 10 waypoints, and pilots program their coordinates into the plane's onboard computer, known as the Inertial Navigation System, INS. To load the route into the INS, the co-pilot reads each coordinate from the printed copy of the flight plan, and the captain enters them into the Inertial Navigation System. In this flight, the pilots were extra careful when entering coordinates because a slight mistake could lead them off course. The Romeo 20 route was only 32 kilometers away from the Soviet restricted airspace. During those days, due to Cold War tensions, the Soviets had imposed a ban on any plane entering their airspace. Additionally, there was a threat that if any plane entered their area, they would shoot it down. The pilots of Flight 007 were well aware of this situation. However, despite this knowledge, they made a mistake, and innocent passengers had to bear the consequences. So, after refueling and completing all the formalities in Anchorage, the process of pushing Flight 007 to the runway begins. The flight is right on schedule, where, according to the plane's plan, it is supposed to land in Seoul in the next 8 hours. So, after completing all the formalities, the plane takes off from Anchorage at 5 in the morning. And just a few seconds after takeoff, The Anchorage air traffic controller contacts them and suggests skipping the first waypoint and heading directly to the second waypoint, Bethel, which is 600 kilometers west of there. This is because it's a shortcut that will save them time. Now, even though the Bethel waypoint was beyond the range of their navigation radios, the pilot decided to heed the advice of the ATC. They engaged the plane's autopilot and set it to the heading mode at an angle of 245 degrees. Here, let me tell you one thing. When the plane is in navigation mode, it automatically follows the coordinates fed into the INS. And because the pilots had entered the coordinates of each waypoint into the INS before takeoff, so they should have continued with NAV mode. However, in the process of taking the shortcut, they had to switch from NAV mode to heading mode. Now, even in heading mode, the plane continues to move forward on its own. The only difference is that in this mode, it doesn't follow any specific coordinates. Instead, the pilot sets an angle, and the plane moves forward in that direction. The pilots planned to switch the plane back from heading mode to navigation mode when they reached the Bethel waypoint, which was a perfectly fine plan. However, the problem arises when the pilots forget to do so. At this time, the plane's altitude is 31,000 feet, and while crossing Bethel, it continues on the same 245-degree angle, turning towards the north, i.e., the Soviet territory. In this way, within a few minutes, Flight 007 crosses the international date line and enters Soviet airspace. That very airspace had strict restrictions against the entry of any aircraft from another country. On that day, Soviet soldiers were in a panic mode because some time ago, they had detected a US biplane on radar flying over the Kamchatka Peninsula in the east of their airspace. It wasn't the first time they had seen a US biplane in their airspace. They had noticed such spy planes for several weeks. Recently, several high-ranking Soviet commanders were dismissed simply because they hadn't shot down those aircraft. However, on this night, after detecting the biplane again, the commanders in Kamchatka decided that they wouldn't let what happened with the other commanders happen to them. They resolved to shoot down the spy plane. As they were searching for the biplane on radar, at the same time, they also detected Flight 007. As time passed, Korean Airlines Flight 007 was heading towards the city of Petropavlovsk on the Kamchatka Peninsula, which was a crucial area for the Soviets. Because there was a variety of valuable information present in this area, and several military bases and airfields had been established here. In such a scenario, if a US spy plane passed through there, it could create significant problems for them. Unfortunately, Korean Airlines Flight 007 unintentionally makes the same mistake. Soviet commanders notice this plane and record every activity. Sometime later, another Soviet radar installation in Kamchatka also detects Flight 007 and begins monitoring it. The crew members or passengers on board have no idea about all this activity happening outside the plane. They have no idea that while flying over the Pacific, they have entered the restricted area of the Soviets. And they are also unaware that just a few minutes away on their right-hand side, there is a US spy plane, which they have recently flown over. Soviet soldiers were tracking both aircraft, and they identified the American biplane as an RC-135. However, they were surprised that the other plane was so daring, heading towards the peninsula. Additionally, its altitude and speed remained constant. On the other hand, the pilots were enjoying the journey, blissfully unaware of the danger. When Flight 007 approached the peninsula, Soviet commanders scrambled fighter jets to intercept and stop it. They quickly closed in on the flight, and in the cockpit of Korean Airlines, the pilots were busy having a normal conversation with their colleagues, unaware of the approaching danger. Flight 007 now flew directly over the Sea of Okhotsk, heading straight towards Sakhalin Island. The Soviet Union had another important area, in a Sukhoi Su-15 fighter plane. Major Gennady Osipovich was also following them. When they saw Flight 007 approaching their sensitive area, they went beneath the plane, hoping that the flight crew might see them. But that didn't happen. Instead, when Gennady Osipovich gets closer to the plane, a very strange coincidence happens. In reality, the pilots are thinking of going to a higher altitude to save fuel, and they send a request to Tokyo Center to allow the flight to climb to 35,000 feet. After that, Tokyo Center accepts their request, and the plane starts climbing to a higher altitude. Meanwhile, seeing the plane climb higher, Soviet officials think the plane is alerted to danger and is trying to escape. Therefore, they instruct Osipovich to quickly destroy the target. Afterward, they fire 2 air-to-air missiles at this passenger plane. The missiles take approximately 15 seconds to reach near Flight 007. And at a distance of about 50 meters it explodes. The shrapnel inside the missile creates holes in Flight 007's fuselage, leading to rapid decompression inside the plane. The hydraulic lines are also cut. After this, chaos ensues on the plane. During this time, the flight engineer confirms that the plane's engines are working properly. This means the problem is not in the engines but somewhere else. No one on the plane understands what is happening. Even the pilot and other crew members are surprised that the smoothly running plane suddenly experienced a drop in cabin pressure. Within seconds, oxygen masks drop, and both passengers and pilots in the cockpit quickly put them on. A few seconds later, the first pilot informs Tokyo Traffic Control that they are facing a severe decompression issue inside the plane. After the attack, the plane rapidly descends, and screams from people are heard all around. Meanwhile, the pilots are struggling to regain control of the aircraft. But after spiraling for 6 minutes, Flight 007 crashes into the sea near Mandarin Island, about 4 to 5 miles off the coast of Japan. And along with this, the lives of all 269 people on the plane were lost. On the other hand, Soviet fighter pilot Major Gennady Osipovich returns satisfied that he has achieved a significant achievement by defeating the enemies. But the next morning, the news spreads worldwide that the Soviet Union has shot down a passenger aircraft, Korean Flight 007. The International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, of the United Nations begins an investigation into the incident. However, due to limited information, they can only prepare a temporary report in the end. In this situation, it becomes a big mystery as to how the plane ended up so far from its intended route. ICAO proposed 2 theories, and according to both, human error was involved in the plane's navigation system. According to the first theory, the autopilot was set to the heading mode instead of being on the inertial navigation system, INS, as it should have been. We explained this in detail in the video. The second theory suggested that the pilot might have entered the wrong coordinates, causing the plane to deviate from its route and enter Soviet airspace accidentally. Now, which theory is correct and which one is wrong still lacks clarity. However, one thing cannot be ignored, that if Soviet commanders wanted, they could have prevented this attack. Because passenger planes have many lights that flash on their wings and tail fin. In contrast, a spy plane never uses these lights as it completes its mission by staying hidden without attracting attention. Now, the Soviet commander says that in the darkness, they couldn't see the color or text on the plane properly. They also couldn't identify whether it was a passenger plane or a biplane. But they must have seen these lights. So, was this fact deliberately ignored or overlooked? The commanders claimed that they did exactly what they were ordered to do. It was even stated that if the plane had exited Soviet airspace, they still had orders to shoot it down. Many people believe that the Soviet Union intentionally targeted Flight 007, perhaps due to enmity with the United States, or maybe to instill fear in the world. So, that was the story of Korean airline Flight 007, which is still considered one of the most dreadful incidents in aviation history today. How did you like this story? Let us know by commenting. Thanks for watching. If you liked our video, please encourage us by clicking on the subscribe button to see more such new videos. We are grateful to you for your kind cooperation.